Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for Seattle Architecture Foundation's webinar, Design in Depth, Growth for Communities, Not as Commodities. My name is Kim Owens, and I'm the Program Director for the Seattle Architecture Foundation. During normal operations, we offer a quarterly Design in Depth lecture series, in addition to a whole host of tours in and around Seattle. But before we go any further, I'd like to let you all know that we are recording this and we will make it available on our website. Seattle Architecture Foundation acknowledges that we are on the traditional land of the Duwamish and other South Coast Salish people, a people forced to relocate, but who have persevered. SAF views the history of Seattle to include from time immemorial to today, and is committed to exploring that through its partnerships and programs. We are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to connect people to the architecture, design, and history of Seattle. We believe the more you engage with design, the more you feel connected to this ever-changing city and inspired to make change. I'd also like to thank our Design in Depth sponsors. At the diamond level, we have LMN Architects. Our platinum sponsors are MG2, Bassetti Architects, and PLS. Gold sponsors include Hargis Engineers and MacDonald Miller Facility Solutions. And last but not least, our grant maker for culture. We truly appreciate the support from these sponsors who make events like tonight's possible. It's because of their generosity we can offer programs like these three of charge. Tonight's program examines how architects and planners can reclaim an active role in the production of space and practice design as caretakers of our communities. The program is inspired by Proactive Practice, an exhibit produced through AIA Seattle's Emerging Professionals Travel Scholarship. Designed and curated by Jaclyn, Hensy, and Tristan Walker, their research examines how architects can self-initiate projects to nurture vibrant and adaptive communities. And I am so thrilled that we have curators Jackie and Tristan with us today to tell you a little bit more about their work, their research. So please, I know you are just as excited as I am to learn more.
Okay. So we first want to say thank you to SAF for organizing today's forum, and thank you to Rick Mohler and his students for asking important questions about architecture's role and its responsibility to the people of this city. We were asked to give a 5-minute overview describing the character of our research as it relates to today's topic. So let's see if we can get this to work. Okay. So this topic stems from an investigation funded by AIA Seattle's Emerging Professionals Travel Scholarship. And we were given support to travel and then open an exhibition showcasing the findings of our research. Our proposed topic was self-initiated architecture, and we traveled to Seattle, New Orleans, Mexico City, London, and Rotterdam to conduct interviews with practices who were doing something interesting with this idea.
So during the course of our investigations, we became more aware of how architecture fits into the market economy and by extension society. In broad strokes, architecture and politics have shifted over the last 70 years. Responsibility for the production of space has been contracted out to the market. The market is driven by private interest, and it favors profit over public benefit. It prioritizes short-term gain over long-term viability. Architecture has been complacent in progressing the will of the market. This is problematic for a number of reasons. People are treated less like active citizens, and instead they assume the passive roles of consumers. There are significant gaps in what our environments provide for us, and we lack agency in our ability to shape and influence our surroundings. As architects, our role has diminished, and our usefulness is often restricted to facade design and technical services. Important qualities of a building, such as who it serves, what programs and services it offers, where it's located, if it's sustainable, and if it's even necessary, these things are all beyond our influence. We think there's a lot of room for provocation, intervention, and exploration by architects who sincerely want to address human needs. And we should apply our expertise to address societal needs, but we can't because we enter the process too late. This questioning was the context that led us to developing a thesis for how architecture could address these problems.
So we view self-initiated projects as one feasible strategy for addressing these issues, and proactive practice examines how architects self-initiate projects to nurture vibrant and adaptive communities. Through the lens of these architects' practices and their progressive work, different models and scales of intervention are presented to encourage us to question the malleability of our own environment. How can we practice architecture as caretakers for our communities and reclaim an active role in the production of space? We chose the following case studies in order to illustrate diversity and intention and to provide different ways of working proactively and to show a range of scales of intervention. Each of these case studies provide context to the conceptual ideas and conclusions drawn in our research. How their work was conducted is just as important as the work itself. And I'm just going to run through these really quickly, but the first was OJT out of New Orleans, and they test and implement strategies for introducing entry-level housing in historical contexts. Block Architects out of Seattle addresses homelessness through community building. Zus out of Rotterdam revived a district that had been cut off by transportation lines from the rest of the city, and they spent 20 years sort of revitalizing this area. And, oops, sorry. And the last one's a Symbol out of London, and they self-initiate spaces that foster creativity and exploration for communities.
So we traveled to each of these architects and we visited their projects and we interviewed them. Through our conversations, we noticed thematic overlaps between their beliefs and processes, and we defined those as the 5 traits, which is a taxonomy of mindset shifts for self-initiation. They're a sort of manifesto and a model for relevant practice in service of collective well-being. So the 5 traits are serve the public, expand the role, form alliances, don't wait for a client, and test in reality. So these case studies, as well as the 5 traits, are all on display at the Center for Architecture and Design, and photos as well as the exhibition catalog are up on the AIA Proactive Practice homepage. The catalog contains conversations with our case studies and on their working methods, so please have a look if you're interested in learning more. And we'll be hosting a series of lectures with new case studies through Space.City this fall, and we'll be following up with discussions on the local level through our new website, which is proactivepractice.co. And we're releasing a book later this year. So we'd like to continue having these conversations and even outside the realm of architecture as well. So if you'd like to connect with us or get on a mailing list or have suggestions for more case studies, please reach out to us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us. I've had the pleasure of seeing their exhibit in the space. It is amazing. Please do check out the catalog. We will put a link in the comments to the web page later on so you guys can know where to find that. And you will have an opportunity to ask them questions. So please use the Q&A function to do so. We're going to save all questions just to the very end to make sure we can, get as much material in as possible. And so with that, I would like to pose the question, what if we could build a new Seattle neighborhood from scratch? Students at the University of Washington College of Built Environments addressed this question in their group studio as they imagined innovative concepts for the future of Interbay neighborhood north of Magnolia Bridge. And now I would like to welcome our panelists. We have David Bloom, AICP Affiliate Instructor of Urban Planning, University of Washington College of Built Environments. We have Alicia Kellogg, a Master of Landscape Architecture candidate, 2021, University of Washington. Eddie Kim, recent Master of Architecture 2020, University of Washington. Grace Kim, AIA Founding Principal of Schemata Workshop. Maura Witzel, new Master of Architecture 2020, University of Washington. And last but not least, Rick Mohler, AIA NCARB Associate Professor of Architecture, University of Washington College of Built Environments. And with that, I'd like to say, take it away, Rick.
Okay, I have requested control and I have unmuted. Okay, there we go. Let's see, will this work? No. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Kim. Before I get started, I should acknowledge that I am a member of the Seattle Planning Commission, as is Grace Kim, who's also a panelist here. And industrial lands is an issue that the commission is very involved in, but I want to stress that we do not speak on behalf of the commission tonight. We are only giving our own opinions. So industrial lands policy in Seattle is complex and controversial. It's been extensively studied and debated, and these are several industrial lands reports the City and Planning Commission have released in the past 13 years. In 2018, Washington State announced that the Washington State National Guard Armory would be moving from its 30-acre site in Interbay, located within the Seattle-Ballard Interbay Manufacturing Industrial Center. The state plans to redevelop the site to offset the cost of the move. The site is an interesting case study for several reasons. It currently has access to bus rapid transit. It will have access to light rail transit at the Smith Cove station immediately to its south. It is just south of another publicly owned parcel, the Interbay Golf Course, which is the City of Seattle Park atop an abandoned landfill. It's adjacent to the Burlington Northern Santa Fe rail lines. And the site illustrates that we ironically have three things all seeking level terrain in the city: industry, light rail, and golf courses. This combination is less the result of planning forces and more the result of running light rail along the most feasible and cost-effective route. So this interesting set of circumstances led David Blum and me to teach an interdisciplinary urban design studio looking at a mix of uses on the site that might leverage the proximity of the site to the surrounding area, to light rail and park space unencumbered by the site's existing industrial zoning. The studio consisted of 24 students, grad and undergrad, from architecture, landscape architecture, and planning, as well as a Master of Structural Engineering student and a Master of Transportation Engineering student who served as consultants to the design teams. Students worked in 6 interdisciplinary teams of 4. The studio is a messy and creative environment to which the students have access 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we started the quarter taking a tour of the site, which was easier said than done due to a communications glitch. Here, 3 guard representatives are all calling superiors to confirm our clearance for access. But once on the site, it becomes clear that it is a very low-lying parcel between Magnolia and Queen Anne Hills. However, from the south end of the site, one can see Elliott Bay. We toured Equinox Studios with Sam Parazano, its founder. It's an interesting mix of uses in Georgetown, and Sam has a plan to include these uses with affordable housing in the future. Uses include light industrial, such as this metal fabrication shop, a blacksmith, and artist studios, galleries, theaters, and performance spaces. All of this was of great inspiration to the students. We engaged with city officials, including Jeff Wentland, who's been tasked by the mayor with reopening the industrial lands conversation. State Representative Gail Tarleton, who co-chairs the committee evaluating uses for the site. Industrial real estate developers like Mike Nelson, who presented market data and case studies on Seattle's industrial lands future. Reviews with members of the Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development and the Seattle Design, Planning, and Port Commissions. We began the project with the following assumptions. First, that the Sound Transit preferred alignment to the east of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe tracks will be constructed at grade at Smith Cove Station and elevated at Interbay Station. This has actually since changed. The Magnolia Bridge will be replaced in essentially its existing location. Seattle's public golf courses will be used for purposes other than golf in the future. The state and city possess the political and administrative capacity to collaborate on this exceptional opportunity. A robust mix of light industrial and flex industrial uses will be developed on the site, and that the sea will rise. We'll see 3 projects today that will be presented, but these 3 will not be included, but I wanted to show them really quickly. The first of these is Center Bay, a new urban center, similar in scale and density to what is proposed at Northgate. Sparks of Industry developed the entire 1-mile distance between the 2 future light rail stations into a series of activity nodes. And Internetwork, which developed the site and surrounding areas into a mixed-use community of 200-foot square Portland-sized blocks. And so I'm going to pass it on to Maura, who's going to present her team's project.
Okay, thank you, Rick. My name is Maura Witzel, and as it was said before, I recently obtained my Master of Architecture. My group consisted of Kasha Cassidy, an undergraduate landscape architecture student, Jason Yan, undergraduate architecture and construction management student, and Ashley Shook, a Master of Architecture student. The project name, urban assemblage, came from the definition. An assemblage is a sculptural technique of organizing or composing a group of often fragmentary objects into a unified whole. The result is an integrated composition which relates not only to itself, but to its context as well. As such, this proposal consists of 3 distinct urban neighborhoods built in 3 phases and connected by a fluid open space that fosters interaction, collaboration, and connection between people and communities within the site. It takes several building uses which are typically separated from each other and fits them together to form a cohesive whole. As previously mentioned, the studio focused on the Armory site in Interbay. With our team's exploration, we expanded past the boundaries of the current Armory site, changed the Magnolia Bridge to loop around the site and provide space for the light rail, and added a pedestrian bridge to connect Magnolia. In the site plan, we have the transit hub to the south. Oh, what happened to the site plan? Okay. For our concept, we began with the Armory site and then used new circulation patterns to define our 3 neighborhoods, which we used to kind of set up our 3 phases. We also planned for climate impacts and stormwater using the existing topography of Queen Anne's Hills and the relatively flat site. We configured a street grid based on a variety of factors, including key points of the site. And finally, we designed the pedestrian experience from the light rail station through the new park and out to Magnolia. We also incorporated a pedestrian and bike connection for the modified Magnolia Bridge. So this is the organizational breakdown of our 3-phase plan. The first phase begins with the industrial district located at the center of the site and the estuary. The second phase incorporates the residential zone and public park. The third and final phase is based on the 2035 date for the Ballard light rail connection and other changes in the city, like the inevitable increased need for affordable housing located near transportation. Phasing the development is an important part of this concept as it provides an opportunity for advancement in innovation strategies and technologies. 2 residential neighborhoods flank the industrial core, which is the heart of innovation and collaboration. Composed of flex industrial spaces and maker spaces, the core is tied to the industrial fabric and legacy within Interbay and, as the first phase of development, provides a strong foundation for future site development. An open market and plaza will foster communal interactions between the core, its workers, and future surrounding residents with all ages play courts, kid areas, and food hubs. Closest to the light rail and train tracks, the industrial spaces provide an acoustic buffer to the more interior spaces of the site, like the market and office buildings. Overall, the first phase preserves the spaces for industrial use while preparing the rest of the area for integrated mixed-use developments. All industrial buildings use systems which generate solar energy for use within the site, and the open marketplace provides access to the outdoor spaces and workers, and eventually the residents. And as I mentioned previously, part of the first development phase, in the first development phase, the site is redesigned to mimic what may have existed in the past. The lowest point of the topography of the site is connected to the west slope of Queen Anne through regrading. The land is modified and extended into the site to create green stormwater infrastructure within the neighborhood, as well as a strong connection to the natural systems. Inspired by Washington State salt marshes, it connects the daily lives of site inhabitants and transit users to a living estuary, while reestablishing a resilient natural condition to work with the high water table and stormwater retention for the landscape. The estuary also addresses climatic changes, the increased likelihood of sea level rise, and demonstrates that new urban development should be sustainable, resilient, and adaptable. The second phase of development is the neighborhood. To the north, phase 2 consists of multifamily mid-rise development tied directly to the public park and former golf course. The park to residence connection was important to emphasize as it was a key element in the concept of a safer residential neighborhood. The park includes an expanded pea patch which connects the park to the neighborhood. At the proposal's northwest corner is the North Hub, which allows for a direct connection to Magnolia for pedestrians and bikers. Included in this phase are interconnected and protected spaces. For instance, this area is protected on both sides by the mid-rise residential buildings, but leads up to the Interbay pea patch beyond. And as a key point on the connection to Magnolia, the North Transit Hub would include uses such as breweries, bike parking, storage, and other amenities for the northern residential neighborhood. The final phase, named the Transit Hub, consists of a high-density, mixed-use, transit-oriented neighborhood developed with the 2035 Ballard Light Rail Smith Cove Station. This area is specifically developed to address the much-needed affordable housing near public transportation in a growing area. Consisting of net zero mass timber towers, the neighborhood is a case study in sustainable urban development designed to meet the needs of a younger working population. The towers would be designed to meet the needs of the city as well as incorporate highly sustainable systems such as water collection reuse, green roofs, and heavy timber construction. The Smith Cove Transit Station also functions as a bike shop, bike storage facility, and sheltered ramp from the Magnolia Bridge to ground level. Overall, future urban developments will need to be viable, innovative, and sustainable in order to meet the needs of the growing population while still emulating the uniqueness of Seattle's vibrant neighborhoods. Using the industrial core as a foundation for development on the site, this proposal seeks to integrate industry within the areas typically reserved for people, landscape, and transit in order to foster interaction, collaboration, and connection. This proposal also suggests phasing the development of the site to match the evolving city codes and sustainable technologies. Through the integration of uses, the site has the potential to become a key nexus of the Interbay neighborhood. Thank you.
Oh, okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Alicia Kellogg. I am a Master of Landscape Architecture candidate at UW. I want to say thank you to Kim and the Seattle Architecture Foundation for having me. And I also wanted to call out the other members of my group who are not here that I get to represent this work that we did together. That's Tristan Hogenstein, who is actually studying abroad here at UW in the fall. He's from the Netherlands, and he was an undergraduate in urban planning. Tara Ponce, who was an undergraduate in architecture, and Daniel Vu, who was a grad student in architecture. And I believe Tara and Daniel also both just graduated. So I'm very proud of them. I'm glad that I got to work with them. So our project is called Convergence, and our whole idea is about how do we bring people into the site and how do we kind of create a gravity here that doesn't currently exist. So I just need to talk a little bit about the context first to give an idea of what we're working with. So these green spaces you see here are kind of the existing green spaces around the existing. You can see the Armory site boundary right here. And all the red lines show existing paths that, as you can see, are all not connected to each other. So Magnolia and Queen Anne are highly segregated by these kind of immovable north-south lines created by the railroad. And it really reinforces Interbay as a place to drive through as a passageway. And the separation of Interbay from surroundings is compounded by rigid industrial zoning. So it really makes it really divorced from the uses and activities around it. So our idea is, it revolves around the idea of convergence. How do we bring together the disparate and disconnected areas outside to create a neighborhood with its own gravity and its own character? You can see here that we have our main gesture, which is this kind of diagonal path through the site called Union Way. And it will connect things not just east and west, but also north and south. The continuous diagonal path is intended to be bike and pedestrian with a series of green spaces along it that helps create convergence within the site itself. So it kind of draws people into that path and helps them get off of that path and enter into the site. It also connects the two green spaces in Magnolia and Queen Anne, and it will connect the future light rail stations to the north and the south, the Interbay Light Rail in the north and the Smith Cove in the south. And even though each area of our design has a different primary use, you'll see in a second that the very few buildings actually have a single use. Most everything is mixed use. So we have 4 points of interest on our site. At the north, we have this kind of futuristic distribution center called the Toy Box. At the heart of our site, we have a civic center called the Innovation Center. In the middle of our industrial area, we have a Maker's Alley, and at the south end, we have an open-air farmers market called the Grand Canopy, and I'll get into that in just a second. So if you can see here, these are the spots in yellow is where we have residential zoning. One thing again to note is that we have a lot of mixed use on our site. So many of the areas that you see are not strictly residential, but have buildings with multiple floors, some of which are non-residential. And you can see here this little isometric down here shows what we'd expect a fully residential building to look like, with a cutout courtyard in the middle in order to create a place for community to gather and to ensure that there's plenty of opportunities for people and families to converge and relax and play. And we have a distribution of a number of units of studios, 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms, which is an attempt to attract families or group co-living situations, but not necessarily aimed at wealthy tech workers who might want a 1-bedroom. Our commercial area is mostly line 15th, which we placed there in order to kind of increase porosity. Increase porosity and there you go. Help draw people into the space from 15th. You'll notice that some of these buildings also have mixed residential on the upper floors. This is what we kind of envisioned that looking like in order to increase our density and really just pack in as much housing as possible. We're preserving some traditional industrial zoning along the railroad tracks to the western boundary, as we believe that industrial usage will be less sensitive to the conditions of being directly adjacent to the railroad tracks. These traditional industrial spaces will be accessible by a road that runs parallel to the railroad tracks and to the planned light rail station, which apparently has changed according to Rick. And that will help keep access with big box trucks to those industrial areas while maintaining this pedestrian bike dominance along Union Way, although Union Way will be able to accommodate vehicles for things like emergencies. And then the new building type that we are introducing is called Flex Industrial, and it will include a mix of businesses like bike repair, 3D printing, carpentry, breweries, maker spaces, industries that are maybe a little bit more accessible to residents and the general public. And many of these buildings will be self-contained and include things like artist lofts on the top floor, allowing makers to keep their work and living and community all contained in one space. So in the middle of this traditional industrial and flex industrial space, we have Maker's Alley. And you can see up here in this little map that this white here indicates kind of where we're looking at right now. So Maker's Alley will follow along both the flex industrial and the traditional industrial spaces that maybe during the day will serve primarily industrial usage, but it'll be a flexible space that can be converted into pedestrian only things like art walks or community events or street fairs. And Maker's Alley will really provide an opportunity for makers and industrial businesses to gain exposure to the large Interbay community, while enticing in visitors or residents to explore the industrial side of the neighborhood, which is typically not super public or visible. Smith Cove, so I didn't go over this too much, but our planned rerouting of the Magnolia Bridge would do something similar to Maura's plan. So the plan to replace the Magnolia Bridge gives us an opportunity to integrate the new Smith Cove station and its satellite service spaces into the structure of the bridge itself. Our proposal shows the bridge bending south right before it meets the site, creating a straight segment. So the bridge would kind of come in like this and then bend south like this. That would create this kind of like straight area right along here, which would act as a roof for this building. And this building would have rest facility like showers and lockers, bike storage, fare stations, maybe like a little barista stand. The roof would also be a long ramp that would bring people up, and it can be annexed into the bridge in the future to create a continuity with an existing bike path on the other side of the tracks. And underneath the bridge is a series of kiosk spaces to foster small businesses serving passengers getting on and off the trains. This long spine of service extends to meet a freestanding roof structure that is the grand canopy. And this would be kind of like an open air market. So our farmers market, which would most of the time be a market, it could also be reprogrammed for other purposes like events. Anchoring the other end of Union Way up here in the northwest corner of the site is a state-of-the-art distribution center called the Toy Box. And this center will stay true to the real sense of distribution. It's with high volumes of circulation and less warehouse storage, which reflects an emerging industrial trend. So the roof of the Toy Box will have solar energy harvest field on one half and a family entertainment complex on the other to capture attention and invite visitors. And so what you're looking at here is a bike path that is connecting from the west. We're looking kind of southeast that would take people into the site, but would also connect to the roof of the Toy Box. So this is a little bit what that view might look like coming in from Magnolia. And these are our drones distributing all of probably Amazon's packages. In the middle of our site right here at the heart is the Center of Innovation, the Innovation Center. We have studied how autonomous and AI technologies will be integrated into different industries and conclude that we need a resilient workforce that could adapt to future changes. So the Innovation Center will provide community services like daycare, a library, convention halls, and also things like classrooms and job training to help train people for new job skills that are going to become increasingly relevant. This Innovation Center is surrounded by other public facilities and many open green spaces. So these green spaces tie the site together. They create a continuous flowing experience from one end of the site to the other, and they create porosity. So there's kind of an alley, like a kind of extended alley of red oaks that line each park along Union Way. So that will help create some continuity between the parks, while also maintaining access to the space beyond. And it's also creating porosity in a literal sense between the parks and the open green spaces in the residential courtyards. We have 280,000 square feet of permeable ground. So that's going to help reduce runoff and the stormwater load sent to our combined sewage system. And the residential courtyards can also have the capacity to retain stormwater and reuse it for gray water for things like dishwashers and toilets. So, our design is really trying to highlight the ideas of convergence, the convergence of people and uses and zoning, bringing flex into traditional industrial, bringing residential into flex, bringing commercial into residential, and bringing the world into Interbay in order to create a destination, a productivity center, and a home. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Eddie Kim. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Our group called our proposal Interbay. And the four of us had pretty different backgrounds. We had Sarah, a landscape architecture major, Migi, an undergraduate studying architectural design, myself as a grad student in the grad architecture program. And we also had an exchange student from Finland studying urban planning. We started by looking at the bigger picture beyond the Armory, recognizing that this is a critical juncture of BNSF, the port, vehicular and transit all happening between these well-established neighborhoods of Queen Anne and Magnolia. Oops, go back, sorry. We were interested in not only strengthening these existing connections with the right mix of program, but to consider the important role that the port and our industrial lands have, and how we can respond to the larger ecosystem of Smith Cove and Elliott Bay. So our vision came down to 3 objectives: to preserve our industrial lands, integrate new light rail and other alternative forms of transit, to reduce the need for car ownership. And while that serves the greater public and the city at the local level, we wanted there to be a strong sense of community. Considering the entirety of Interbay introduced several different stakeholders, and we're interested in seeing how the city and key players can form partnerships with the state sale of the Armory to introduce new mixed use development, a mix of affordable and market rate housing to serve the best interests of Interbay as a community. And we looked at the report by the advisory committee to learn more about the public engagement process. And considering the larger ecosystem, we became interested in this notion of ecotone, or the transition between different biological communities. And as we thought about the future of this site, we also wanted to restore the native ecology to the extent possible, to create moments that relate the site back to its native past, maintain a strong connection to the water, celebrate the maritime industrial heritage of Seattle. And with the opportunity for views to the mountains, the sound, urban forests, at the ground, our idea was for a series of villages to connect the 2 proposed light rail stations. This was an early scheme looking at the street level use, and it's not exactly where our proposal ended up, but it shows our idea of connecting the 2 stations with the right amount of amenity and energy in street uses along 15th Avenue. And because this would displace some of the golf course, we considered how that would be replaced in kind as required by the city ordinance, and how that park space could get distributed across the site. Central to our proposal is a new city park that creates a destination in the city for this unique park experience that would extend for over a mile from Dravis Street to Smith Cove and connect to the Elliott Bay Trail. Rather than use the park as a buffer to the rail yards, we designed this industrial building that stretches the length of the Armory site, which we called the Shed. And as part of the flood mitigation strategy, this extension, the extension of this park consists of wetland and tidal mudflats to bring back some of the shoreline conditions that existed before this area was filled. And here's our proposed program at street level. And the heart of this new neighborhood is this intersection of a live-work creative village adjacent to a technical institute for vocational skills training, and the Shed, which could house 1 or multiple different industrial tenants, providing on-site jobs, learning experience, all situated along this mile-long park and residential community. Here's a 3D view of the site, and across this total of 90 acres, half of which is to maintain the original 45-acre area of the golf course. We are proposing about 3,400 residential units, 500,000 square feet of industrial IG2 zoning, along with institutional, commercial, and community space. Our strategy with traffic was to gradually transition the wide corridor of 15th to more local and slower traffic in the pink zone, with WUNRFs towards the park and along the edges of the wetland. We plan for freight access with a dedicated route just for service, emergency, and employee vehicles to access the shed building with a central loading facility at the center. The site is within a flood hazard zone. And when we look at the 100-year storm surge, it shows the entirety of the armory and the port lands inundated with water. So a major flood event here would cut off this critical north-south access for not just vehicular traffic, but the railway, BNSF. So we wanted to address this as much as possible. This is a site section looking north with a proposed park between the shed building and residential development. This shows some of our different eco-district strategies. And in response to flooding, our idea was to locate critical building services above the first level and think about how certain space types, such as below grade parking, could be flood-proofed and flood tolerant and serve as a kind of a cistern during storm surge events and high flooding. And a view of the wetland park, which we saw as not just being a place for recreational use, but also for education and research in studying the tidal flat conditions and the water quality. And this is zooming in at that kind of nexus of a live-work community with artisanal and maker spaces and campus for skills training with the more heavy and industrial uses at the shed across the park. And there's an interior view of that down the bottom right. Something we were particularly excited about was this idea of how these townhomes could create a unique living experience facing this mile-long park, and a place intended to be a mix of different unit types for families, for seniors and single households, which we saw as key components to creating a vibrant and inclusive community. And part of our construction phasing strategy was to begin with construction of the park and the shed building, followed by residential development to introduce units to the site so that by the time light rail opens in 2035, it could support more dense and high-rise development. A potential tenant for the shed could be part of the emerging mass timber construction industry, not just for fabrication, but also research, prototyping that's associated with advancing the building code and the technology needed to support that. And we even thought about how this facility could participate in the development of this site and be a pilot project for large-scale mass timber development. By carving into the site for the wetland park, we proposed to use that fill to table up the development to get that finished grade higher above sea level as much as possible. And that open space helps to balance the taller, more dense development. So we thought carefully about the scale in creating this strong pedestrian experience. So as this new hub for the port and our industrial jobs, we see this as a transformative and vibrant mixed-use innovation and eco-district that's both a strong community and a destination in the city. And with the potential for partnership between the city, the state, as well as different public and private entities, we hope to see this opportunity we have with Interbay to become a model for large-scale sustainable urban development going forward. Thank you so much. So were we gonna jump to?
I think I'm going to give a little wrap up here.
Oh, that's right. Sorry.
So reviews, So a public presentation of the student work concluded the quarter and was attended by former Governor Gary Locke, also a co-chair of the state's advisory committee evaluating uses for the site. As well as Representative Gail Tarleton and Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development Director Sam Asefa, and this provided a unique opportunity for parties from the city and state to discuss the Armory site within the context of the student work. The presentation was followed by a public exhibit of the work, and the work received press coverage from The Urbanist, KUOW, and Como News. The research and design process yielded the following takeaways. First is to look at the full potential of the site and surrounding area by recognizing that substantial state and city-owned parcels are nearly adjacent to each other. To create a new neighborhood with a strong identity and sense of place. To zone the site to provide some segregation of uses. To use the industrial zone as a buffer to the Burlington Northern Santa Fe rail line. To provide separation between freight, bicycle, and pedestrian mobility, to provide a pedestrian bicycle connection to Magnolia from the northwest corner of the site, to leverage the replacement of the Magnolia Bridge and the Sound Transit Smith Cove Station as a single integrated project to enhance pedestrian and bicycle access to the station, to explore new hybrid building types that combine light industrial, flex industrial, office, and live work uses, to recognize and leverage disruptive changes in distribution technology, and to recognize the inevitability of sea level rise and the potential to address it through ecologically sensitive strategies. So I believe it now gets passed to David, who's going to talk a little bit about this from a development perspective.
Thank you, Rick. My name is David Blum. I co-taught the studio with Rick. I'm an affiliate instructor in the Department of Urban Design and Planning and a real estate developer by background. One of the things that many people asked during the studio, and of course today, is how can this actually be built? What is necessary for this project to take shape? So as Rick very well explained, there is a current condition of land use, which is exclusive to industrial use. And there is a strong market for industrial space. Having said that, there is also obviously a pent-up demand for housing in Seattle. And what we tried to do is find examples of how these can be co-located in the marketplace. Not necessarily from what is the design optimized concepts. Our students did an excellent job of that, but how would the market respond to this opportunity? The state owns the property, but the city controls the land use. So between the two, a public-private partnership could be envisioned if there were sufficient incentive. So what we see here are some best practices in design of industrial flex space that are, shall we say, present in other countries and other places in the world. I just happen to have spent a number of summers leading UW study abroad programs to the Netherlands. And it's an urban country, well connected by public transit, very dense, 16.5 million people in the size geographic area of New Jersey. And they have done this for many years. Here's a particular example of a mixed-use flex industrial building with retail and industrial and makerspace in Eindhoven, fairly sizable town in the central part of the country. You might note the wall art on the right. Dutch never miss an opportunity to add art in public space. Here's a locomotive shed that was turned into a bookstore, cafe, retail, and other uses that also integrate well with current industrial use. So there are foundries and other fabrication activities in this building, along with these retail and public spaces. A public library in that shed in Tilburg, a smaller town in the Netherlands with beautiful open seating areas. An industrial building more conforming to American style, but nonetheless allowing retail and is accessible by public transportation in Schoenberg. Here's a project in Amsterdam with industrial space on the first floor and housing on the second floor. So you can see, of course, the Dutch are well known for using space highly efficiently, that in the Netherlands, from a regulatory point of view, it's not that these uses are separate, it's that they are encouraged to be blended where appropriate. So that's one theory to postulate here is, could the land use be changed either from the proposed developer or from the city to lead to a public-private partnership? And if it's not changed, how will this actually happen? Another example of an industrial building with a restaurant, you can see the former railroad tracks right on the floor. Another example in Madrid. So let's turn our attention to what the actual market is. I study markets for a living, and I was very interested to learn from Ken Smith of Trammell Crow, a national developer of industrial space. What is the story today in Seattle? This is a fascinating set of facts, if you're interested, that only 7% of all the industrial space in the Seattle marketplace is classified as light industrial or maker space. 93% is the traditional truck-served bulk distribution that is dependent on, generally speaking, freeway access and local street access that permits high volumes of truck traffic. So from just what is there now, the question would be, on these 25 acres, how would the developer engage the marketplace for small space? Is there growth in this maker space light industrial sector? Generally speaking, people think that there is. And there is some reason to believe that some elements of the students' concepts would have a robust support in the market today. Having said that, let's look at what has been built. Still in all, this is in Ballard, you see where there is some industrial flex office space, it's not very creative. It is primarily to meet the minimal cost of construction demand, lower the rent, and to afford some cross subsidy. By that we mean that maybe the first floor retail spaces aren't profitable per se, but there is some net operating income generated by the second, third, and fourth floors of the makers and light industrial spaces that are used to offset perhaps the deficit or maybe even just the break-even rent received from the first floor retail spaces. As you may imagine, these are fairly conventional templates of how tenants are developed into 4,500 square foot units, majority office space, some laboratory, light manufacturing, warehouse. In this particular building, there's a craft brewery, a snowboard binding manufacturer, an electric bike company, and a food tech company. So those rents are likely to be what drives the financial model here, not what you could collect on the first floor from the retail market. Here's a project in Sodo that's in the planning phase, 4 stories, 53,000 square foot floor plates, clear height of 20 to 14 feet, parking ratio that allows people to drive to work, even if that's not preferable, probably for bank financing. But nonetheless, a fairly conventional building, certainly not by Dutch standards, adaptive reuse of existing industrial space. This is a 13,500 square foot demise per unit. Again, majority office, lab, light manufacturing, warehouse, and of course, the project hasn't been built, so there are no tenants. So now I'm going to turn it over to Grace to talk about the history and why the maritime industrial demand in Seattle continues to be strong and what it might mean for this space.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to, let's see. So I'm going to talk a little bit from a sort of different angle, but I'm going to go back a little ways to give some context around our industrial lands. So our city being bordered by water, since the founding of our, since before our founding, industrial uses have really centered around maritime uses. And so long before white settlers landed on the shores of Alki, we had Coast Salish people that were using their canoes to transport people up and down. And as the city became more colonized, logging and construction really changed our waterfront to become one that was designed to support the distribution of these maritime distribution of these goods. And at the turn of the 1900s, the waterfront saw a massive transformation to the piers and the wharfs that you see today. And the primary function was to serve as a main north-south arterial to be served by the rail cars that were bringing goods and services north and south. As recent as, actually maybe it's not so recent, in the early 2000s, Allied Arts, as they were starting to start the conversation with design professionals in our city about how we could possibly transform our waterfront, a large contingency of proponents that were proponents of the industrial lands cited freight mobility as one of the most primary uses and functions of the Seattle waterfront. And so that really became sort of the starting point of a conversation with the city about the purpose of the industrial lands, the future of the industrial lands, and kind of how the city was going to support those. There were a number of reports that were created. Rick mentioned some of those. And there were a number of public meetings, stakeholder focus groups, surveys, interviews, many conducted by the city and some specifically conducted by the Seattle Planning Commission. And I will just reiterate for those that have just joined, Rick and I are both members of the Planning Commission, but we are here tonight not as representatives, but just speaking for ourselves. The report was comprised of 3 sections. The first was the stakeholder themes. And I'm not going to read all these themes, but I would say that there was a need for clear definition of what industrial business meant. There was definitely a recognition that the lack of certainty made it difficult for businesses to make long-term investments, and that the increasing cost of land was forcing industrial businesses to either leave Seattle altogether or to really limit and hamper their potential for expansion. And while there were many different combinations of stakeholder groups, meaning that some were businesses, some were landowners, some were both, all of the stakeholders engaged could unanimously state that they agreed that no land should be used for anything other than industrial uses. There were a number of observations that the Planning Commission noted from these various meetings and engagements. The one thing that I will highlight is number 2, that industry in Seattle in 2007, and this remains true today, 13 years later, is that industry is vibrant and thriving in Seattle. The vacancy rates in the industrial lands is extremely low, meaning that there is a high demand and a high usage of these very limited lands. So as the Planning Commission created their recommendations, this was sort of the frame and the lens by which they looked at it. They noted that the industrial lands were a vital asset to our city. They were critical to our economic and global competitiveness, and that they allowed for us to have stability in our economy and to really provide a substantial number of family wage jobs. Of the 6 Planning Commission recommendations, I will particularly note number 6, and that is that the Planning Commission recommended that we really consider whether or not there were other zones, other places in the city that could accommodate some of the research and development or light industry, as David and some of the students have noted. if they could be accommodated in other zones in the city. I would highly applaud the work of the students, and I love the examples that David shared. I think those are all things that are exciting and vibrant and rich. But I do worry that that we take that vibrancy and that quality and character that we're trying to create is a lure that is potentially damaging to the future of our city. I show a photograph of Nordhavn in Copenhagen, and Copenhagen is was one of the major top port cities in the world. And like other cities in Northern Europe, all around the Netherlands and elsewhere, that have transformed these major segments of land that were dedicated to cargo container transport and distribution of goods, many of them have transformed into these, vibrant industrial maritime mixed uses. And having walked around this neighborhood, it is quite fantastic to see all these new buildings and all this activity, silos that have been transformed into housing and new uses, all of this stuff in the foreground, these, blocks of new apartment buildings and offices and things are all new to replace what used to be, several different piers of cargo containers and freight uses. I will also note that there are many cities in the US that have given over their industrial lands to other uses. And now they are in a position where they are mourning that loss. There is no way to regain those industrial lands because the cost of whatever it transformed into, residential, mixed use development, the rent cost, the cost of that land is far in excess of what you could buy it back for or rent it out for in terms of industrial uses. And so there are cities that are mourning this loss. Oops, I went the wrong way. From an equity standpoint, I want to point out that the industrial lands employ 106,000 people in industrial jobs today. That's 18% of our total employment for Seattle. And 67% of those jobs require only a high school diploma or no formal education. For those people that are working in fishing and maritime, transportation, or in steel manufacturing, average earnings for a worker might be over $100,000 a year. So those are really good, family wage jobs. The loss of those jobs could lead to a further separation of our society of the haves and have-nots, of having really technical workers that are paid lots and lots of money and those that are very, very disadvantaged. While I agree that there is a massive housing crisis in play right now, and I appreciate all of the projects that have shown the incorporation of affordable housing, the industrial lands are actually the worst place to house low-income people and people of color. From a standpoint of choice, you're putting the people that have the least choice in neighborhoods that are known to have high soil contamination, poor air quality, and high prone to liquefaction zone. So whether it's the people that are living there and the impact to them and their health, or whether it's to the developers, the nonprofit developers that are trying to build in those areas that have increased development costs, there is a question about equity that needs to be considered. Both Rick and Eddie pointed out sea level rise and the potential of that in our site at the Armory. And so that's noted here. You can see in this chart the areas in our city that are industrial lands here in Interbay, over in the Ballard, Duwamish area. Oops, that's up further north, I should say. And then over in Harbor Island and through the Duwamish, that area is known to be the highest, the points of first inundation and first exposure to sea level rise. So there is a concern about, potentially low-income residents who might be housed in these areas that are going to be the most dramatically affected. And so I will just conclude my portion with the note that while it is very exciting, the idea of incorporating these mixed uses in and maker spaces and the integration of residential into these industrial zones, I really would like to go back and think about the recommendation of the Planning Commission of might these uses be better served in other neighborhoods or other zones in Seattle. Like, I think we need to be thinking about what market conditions and what policy changes might need to happen in order to accommodate these, so that rather than taking over industrial zones, I'm going to put out a radical thought because the Planning Commission is full of radical thoughts, but you know, might we think about how single-family neighborhoods might be adapted or density increased to allow other types of uses so that people could work close to their homes, so that some of these maker spaces and areas that could benefit from people coming to visit them and buying their goods could be located in places that are full of people rather than full of trucks and freight. So I will leave it at that and turn it over for questions, I think.
Okay, thanks, Grace. We do have a couple of questions. They seem to be growing in the queue here. We do have one very straightforward question. This is for Alicia. Alicia, the question is the continuous diagonal path called Union Way an existing path?
No, it's a new path, and the connections especially in the northwest corner where it would connect over the BNSF tracks into Magnolia, that would all be new. And pretty much everything that exists south of the golf course and north of where the current bridge is all new that we're proposing in our plan.
Okay. We have three related questions here, all by Brock Howell. And I'm going to sort of toss them out to both Grace and David. I'll read them all since I think they're connected. The first is that if industrial businesses are doing so well in Seattle, why should we be concerned whether they can compete against other uses? How many jobs per acre do industrial lands provide relative to the people per acre in the students' proposals? Does it make sense to build a light rail station at this location if the area isn't developed?
So I can answer
yeah, go ahead.
I'll answer the first question and I'll let David maybe address some of the other ones. I would say that, while industrial uses are doing well, the cost to rent or the cost to lease industrial lands is a fraction of what it costs to build, develop, and rent or lease residential uses. It's something I'm going to make numbers up, so I apologize, but they're in the magnitude of $5 a square foot for industrial lands versus $35 plus for residential and commercial uses per square foot. So it's quite significant, and that is why industrial uses are not going into mixed use neighborhoods. They cannot afford the rents that developers are asking for in those neighborhoods.
Well, and in many cases, they're precluded from going into those neighborhoods.
Yeah, much less the lack of zoning. Yeah.
So my counter to this, Brock, is that these are not mutually exclusive in the marketplace. That you can have various types of industrial, fabrication, retail, and commercial that work financially and from a land use point of view. I do agree with Grace that the interposition of residential use is complicated. This property is not highly polluted. There are certainly effects from the trains that go by, both in air quality and noise pollution, and the delivery of trucks. My question really is, why do we have such a rigid and inflexible land use system when the very nature of industrial and fabrication is changing through technology and the normal course of the marketplace? I would argue as a developer that planning lags substantially the reality of the marketplace, that planners think in somewhat of a frozen in time mentality, while developers are all about meeting the market. If they don't meet the market, there's no bank financing and there's no project, and then there's no developer fee and there's no business, and then they don't eat. So I have a very different perspective on what happened in 2007 or 1957 when we had a different type of industrial activity in the United States than we do and that we will. and that the land use regulations are woefully out of date from the technical point of view to encourage a mix of use, even under the umbrella of what is called industrial lands. It's too primitive and unsophisticated.
And I would actually not disagree with David, but I do think that if you think about these types of uses, these transitional industrial uses, if we're going to be looking anywhere, I would encourage us to think heartily about whether or not those old zoning segregations of housing versus neighborhood commercial versus industrial. The amount of land designated to industrial is a pittance when you compare it to the amount of land designated to single family in our city. 60 to 70%, depending how you break it down. So if we're going to talk about arcane strategies for how we use our land, I would point to another part of our city to think about where we might be able to incorporate those types of vibrant mixed uses that incorporate residential.
I would agree with that. However, the current zoning here will make it very, very difficult to drag a developer into an acquisition from publicly owned property to build higher, taller, more dense industrial product when it is currently precluded, or shall we say severely limited by the zoning, because the 25 acres cannot be developed horizontally without some relief, my opinion, profitably, to height, setback, and coverage. That to me is the ultimate failure of the rigidity of the current land use.
We actually have a number of other interesting questions too, and I would love it if the students could plug in on some of these as well. One thing we haven't really talked about specifically, but I think it is the reason we are here having this conversation, is that there will be a light rail station built at both ends of this industrial zone in 2035. So maybe this goes to you, Grace, but what is our obligation? You know, I think it's pretty clear that we're not building these stations here because it's necessarily the place that makes the most sense to build the stations. It's where they're going to end up being. What obligation do we have to best leverage our $60 billion regional investment in light rail transit? And how do we balance that against the demand for, and yes, the need for, looking at it through a social equity lens, higher paying industrial jobs?
Yeah, I think that's the big question. It's like, I mean, I guess I'll back up and say, you know, to your point, is this the right place to be building those public investments? Some might say that that train has left the station. But I think that, you know, that's a bigger policy planning question that I wish had been more forefront in the conversations. But given that might be sort of a foregone conclusion, I don't disagree that those that public investment shouldn't be leveraged. But I would challenge, does it need to be leveraged to benefit development community, or should it be leveraged to benefit the public, right? The greater Seattle community. And that's where I think that the job creation is key. I think that just, you know, looking forward into the future, I think as a society, we need to really question, is having all of our young people go off to college and rack up $100,000 of student debt, is that really the way of the future? Or is there a role for young people to actually go into building trades? And if there are more people available in those sort of trade jobs, what does the workforce look like to accommodate them? Or what is the job place to accommodate them?
Hey, Rick, do you mind if I chime in a little bit? Okay, I just wanted to kind of continue with what Grace is saying. It's definitely important that we are looking at the industrial lands and preserving heritage and looking at the market and the history and the jobs per acre. But I think to the point of considering the public in these conversations and, you know, considering more than just the economics, looking at the social aspects of this, looking at the environmental aspects of this, I think it's really important, regardless of, you know, what the student proposals look like or what future proposals look like, to remember that it's important to have all three aspects in the conversation. I think, you know, there's a big issue now with pollution of industrial lands and the surrounding areas, and those areas are typically lower income. You mentioned the single family housing issue, and that ties a little bit to our affordability and housing issue. So I just kind of wanted to jump in and say that I think a lot of our proposals try to address these a little bit, but really these issues are so big and complex, and we need people from all areas, from design, from planning, from real estate, to kind of like come together and really talk about this, which is why I'm excited to be doing this and have done the studio. So just wanted to convey that.
Thanks, Mara. That's an excellent segue into a question here from Ray that's directed to the students. With a few months space since the original assignment, including the pandemic and the social movement, what parts of your projects have you been rethinking for better or worse?
I actually read a pretty interesting article today that argues we should not return our economy to business as usual. We should actually embrace this mentality of not needing to constantly overproduce and have ridiculously long working hours, and, you know, basically we're just throwing carbon out into the world. And I thought it was kind of interesting because I think there is an overall sense that we want to go back to how things were. And with all of the stuff that's happened since, you know, even just December, I don't know that we will have I don't think we will go back to a normal. I think that's true for architecture. I think that's true for how people work, whether they work from home, work remotely, work in not open spaces, because that could be an issue. And I think overall it might start to shift, you know, what are we valuing? What are we putting our taxes and funds to? What companies are we supporting? You know, I think there will be a shift that maybe the economics of something are not inherently more important than the social aspects or the environmental aspects. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been thinking about and looking at.
I've thought a little bit specifically about, even in the short term, how this makes us think about domestic manufacturing, and not even more than domestic, like within the city, facilities that can support that kind of use. And I think when we think of the need for a large interior space, or even like a stadium to be turned over to temporary hospital use, I think, you know, we are so centrally located with Interbay, and we have the land area to potentially develop the large footprint buildings needed for industrial use. That creates an additional kind of asset in critical times of needing to respond, particularly if that industrial use could give over in a flexibly transition to, say, some immediate manufacturing need. And so that kind of potential for developing that so central into the city is a great asset.
I've been thinking a lot about what kind of ramifications working from home, especially in our massive tech sectors, might have on our housing market. Expedia just moved into Interbay, whatever, last year, and that was a huge component in our planning. And how do we design a space that's going to be responsive to that, but not beholden to Expedia being there? And the reality is, if Expedia and these tech companies are looking to move to models where they're having 50, 75, 90% of their workforce working from home a large chunk of the time, that's really going to affect demands on transit, demands on housing. And I've been thinking about, a lot of the things that Grace has been talking about too, with housing equity. And I don't think any of us felt good about putting housing in this area, learning what we learned about, these like unregulated coal carts and the particles that are being released into there every time they zoom by. It kind of feels like we were a little bit trying to solve all the problems because this was a student project, and so we weren't really ambitious. But I'd like to think that if the tech sector is moving in a direction where it's going to relieve some of that pressure on the housing market, that this space doesn't have to be the solution to all the issues. And I've also been thinking about what happens with the decentralization of all of our distribution. And I think that the toy box distribution center that we had on our site is maybe becoming more relevant than ever. Having little hubs, kind of the way that Amazon's already doing with these little stores all around the city. What could that look like if it was more automated, and how could that help people get access to things quicker and more affordably, and potentially with something like drones that would maybe be better for the environment. So I think that there are things about this project that are more relevant than ever, and some things that are all it took was a global pandemic, and all of a sudden lots of things are very irrelevant.
Rick, if I can take a crack at that question too. There was also another question about how many jobs per acre that Brock had answered, so I'll try to answer both. I think that the COVID sort of stay-at-home, work-at-home order has pointed out that model, the remote working, works really well for those that are in white-collar jobs, the tech sector, professional services. We can do our work from remote, but the blue-collar jobs, you cannot make rebar remotely. You can't make an I-beam remotely, right? You can't do fishing remotely. So there are the blue-collar jobs, the industrial jobs actually need a physical place. And while, yes, Brock, you could argue that the number of jobs per acre for industrial lands is low, because you could stack tech workers, in a very dense density per square foot in a high-rise tower. You can't do the same for steel. I'm just using the steel industry as an example, but it could translate to other things where you're manufacturing large things. In steel production, the rebar comes out in long threads, or the beams or whatever. So you need a long linear component. By producing steel in the city, you are reducing the impact to the environment. You're not creating pollution by transporting these things from far distances. You are able to lower the cost of construction by having the goods more locally available rather than reliant on overseas or out of state production. You're allowing for diversity of incomes in the city. And from a tax standpoint for the city itself, from a stability of what's happening with the tax structure or the revenues for the city today, the industrial jobs have provided a stable base of taxes for the city over every single recession and high point. While everything else is going like this, the industrial jobs have provided a tax base that has been very, very steady. So I think there's many reasons that we can't just measure jobs per acre and say that that's the reason to not have or have industrial lands for industrial jobs.
We only have about 5 minutes left, and there are two other questions in the queue that we haven't gotten to, and I'll throw them both out just so they're out there. The first is from Andy Dannenberg, who's actually on our college faculty. He's also in the medical school, and he taught an environmental health class looking at the Armory site last quarter. He's asking if we could comment on liquefaction when the big earthquake comes, which development use may be built at a reasonable cost to be most resilient. Second question comes from Caroline. What is the alternative if a mixed use is not used in this particular location? I'm not sure that any of us really have the technical expertise to field the liquefaction question, although we did benefit from having a Master of Structural Engineering student in the studio. She did a lot of research into the geological conditions on the site, and it's not great. There's a lot of the city, low-lying parts of the city that consist of fill. They are all liquefaction zones. It's a little bit worse here. It can be solved with engineering. The building can be stabilized. The land may move around the building, but the building itself will be stabilized. Anything that's built on the site, even if it's a single-story industrial building, will be built on piles that go down to more stable soil conditions. It's obviously more complicated and expensive to build a high-rise building on there than a single-story industrial building. But the complexities of building in a liquefaction zone exist in any of these building types. Other thing that was pretty interesting, a number of years ago, we did another BE studio, much more speculative, where one student team looked at the kind of post-earthquake scenario. And if we were to build the city in locations where it actually makes sense to build the city next time. And it's quite remarkable if you actually look at this strictly through a lens of, say, an Ian McHarg design with nature strategy. There's a lot of the city where you just wouldn't build on. We have lots of residential buildings built on steep slopes that are subject to landslides under earthquakes. So that's a pretty tough question. In terms of the alternative, and I think this also relates to the question, I guess I'll toss it out to you, Grace, and maybe David can follow up. The most recent development that's occurred adjacent to the Armory site is suburban strip mall development. Which suggests that that's maybe what the market is demanding given the zoning. I think we would probably all agree that that's not a favorable use of land that's well within a light rail transit watershed. So how do we keep that from happening?
I'm gonna cheat and go back to your first question first. Because that's a harder one. The one that you just asked is harder. I would say my comment to the liquefaction question, I think, is similar to inundation. We often think about in our practice in working in sort of shoreline areas, what would happen if, right? So very much like in inundation, if there's liquefaction, all of a sudden there's, if it was industrial jobs, yes, it would suck that major, businesses would be shut down, but people could continue living, right? So their daily lives, their family would not be impacted in a significant way. If we're talking about introducing residential uses into industrial lands, now you're talking about severely impacting people's ability to go and come from their home, to be frightened and sort of at risk in a much more traumatic and mental psychological way. So I think of those kind of, any sort of natural disaster, how resilient is the place to accommodate that? And I think for me, that's even more reason to not introduce the residential component. I don't necessarily think that, going back to your latter question, I don't think that the industrial uses necessarily have to be singular in stack, right? We see them today as one level, warehouses, steel plants, whatever it is. But to Alicia's project, the idea of the toy box, there could be multiple levels of distribution or multiple levels of higher density industrial uses. I don't discount that. We have a project in the Interbay that was done for a private client, and the industrial uses in that include a brewery, include commercial space, include other industrial uses that don't really make sense to put in a neighborhood commercial setting. And it isn't a steel manufacturing plant or any sort of large distribution, but there can be uses like that, a welding shop, furniture making, things like that that are noisy and that are, that there could be some, you know, symbiotic benefit of having them close to another, having an iron worker who can weld the legs of a table that a woodworker is building. Like, that's great to have those compatible and nearby, and they could potentially be stacked up. So I don't say that we should not have residential and therefore have single story, single use kind of industrial. I think that there could be, you know, a reinvention of what happens to some of our industrial lands that doesn't look like what it has been. But I do worry about the incorporation of residential and what that, the health and psychological and economic impact of having residential in the industrial lands. And to you, David. Oh, you're muted, David.
Yes, I agree with what you're saying, Grace. Time will tell. There's a couple $100 million of public investment in these two link light rail stations. So the density of the use of the site will matter if nobody's riding the light rail to go there because everybody drives their pickup truck to go to work. The fear that Rick has articulated about a strip mall scenario, because that's what the market and the land use support, is a disaster financially. The state would never sell land at that discounted value because they already have in mind a significant appraised value that they need, quote unquote, to make the transaction. So it's an interesting storyline of how it will play out between what the state's financial need is to fund the new National Guard headquarters outside of Seattle and what the regulatory response to the market will be. 1 and 2 don't always equal 3. So I think it's stay tuned, see what happens. But it would be a good idea to explore this beyond the theory, because the state is going to enter a disposition phase of this property in the near future, hopefully. And the land use matters. It matters a lot.
I wonder, David, do you think that there could be a possibility if the state were to put out an RFP to developers and said, okay, residential is off the table, and we want to see a development that yields X dollars in terms of a land sale, and we want you to come up with, and we want to increase industrial jobs. Like if the city or the state collaborated and wrote a joint RFP that listed sort of the outcomes that they wanted to see, do you think that it's not possible that developers would be like, oh, yeah, we can do that?
I think it's very possible. I think it's a great idea. I don't think residential is a fatal flaw. I think some cooperative and flexible, more sophisticated way of procuring the engagement of the development sector to meet the state's needs in the way you just said, Grace, would be exactly what I would do. I would offer it with very strict goals and objectives, environmentally, financially, and all the rest. I do think you would get a positive response from the market. And I think the product developed over many years would be very good. I think it's a win-win-win if it's done carefully and intelligently. I really do. I don't see any major obstacles to making this a success.
Could I add on to that, David? I think you know, if this area didn't support, if the cost for building residential in this liquefaction zone just didn't pencil, and if the market really only supports, say, big box retail, could it be done not in isolation? Like, can we look beyond the parking lot and beyond the big box store? How does that connect and be walkable to the the proposed transit stations? Similarly, with the transit stations, it may not be the most desirable place to build them based on the adjacent use, but this is a corridor and it's adjacent to large neighborhoods. And I think we kept combining, a lot of our groups kept combining the Magnolia Bridge, the aging infrastructure of that bridge with this station, because we're not seeing them as separate things. Why not improve the pedestrian experience and access on that bridge from Magnolia so that people can bike to this station? Can we design, if it's got to be single story retail, can we design the retail in a way that connects, residents on the west slope of Queen Anne to use that retail on their way to and from light rail stations? And then there's a cluster of companies and industries around Fisherman's Terminal. And so could that cut down the need for commuting by car? So I think that was a big takeaway for me in this studio, was we can't look at these major projects in isolation. We have to look at the bigger, what it's connecting to.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big takeaways for me from the student work is just the extraordinary opportunity of having these two sizable publicly held parcels in close proximity to one another. Eddie mentioned the Magnolia Bridge. I think I would hope that as we move forward, we can break down silos, not just between disciplines, but between different levels of government, and that we can really begin to leverage these projects to do more than they've done in the past. We don't have the money for them not to do that. So the idea of having the Magnolia Bridge also be, at least in part, the Sound Transit Light Rail Station at Smith Cove, to be able to look at land swaps between the city and the Interbay Golf Course and the Armory site, so that you can actually move mixed use construction, if there is any, further out of the liquefaction zone. I think the Eco-Bay did that. All of the projects proposed something along those lines. Eco-Bay probably to the greatest degree, where literally all of the mixed use construction was pushed to the east. And the only thing that was really in the serious liquefaction zone was the industrial uses. So we can do that. I mean, if the city and the state were to get together and collaborate, we could make something really amazing happen in this location.
Vancouver, British Columbia is a really good example of what Rick is saying, because they've integrated land use first and last mile solutions. And if you go to Burnaby on the light rail system, you see all this happening. It's all accessible by light rail. The big box stores, the residential towers, the light manufacturing, they have figured it out through a regional government partnership of individual cities and the transit agency. We don't have a government structure like that, but we should look north to really good examples of how it works, because it works beautifully there.
Right.
So there's, I think this will be our last question because we need to wrap up, but I'd like to bring Tristan and Jackie into the conversation and to see if they see a connection between this conversation and their research.
Yeah, to start off, excellent work by everyone. Thought there was a lot of really interesting ideas. Throughout the presentations, we couldn't help but think about one of the case studies that we visited in Rotterdam specifically. They're called Zeus, and their whole thing was conducting work in this district that had been totally cut off by transportation and rail and shipping lines from the rest of the city. It was the old historic center, but and it was filled with millions of square feet of old office space that was totally vacant by this point, by the time they moved into it. And there came about this huge redevelopment plan to totally demolish everything and rebuild as an international business district with a lot of high-end residential as well. And their response was sort of a rejection of that idea in favor of treating the area more as a laboratory to test planning ideas, incentivizing slow and adaptable growth over time instead of immediate transformation, and incentivizing and celebrating the existing buildings and users. And that's, I think, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes a bit back to what Grace was saying. you know, the industrial nature of the site and looking at how to actually, you know, thinking about it as serving the public of this area. Might it be through the industrial jobs that would be created to keep this area being industrial? But there's also the fact that you know, the rail line's coming through no matter what. I mean, the case study talks about an aggressive plan that they were rejecting. And it's funny that everyone's kind of mentioning that this rail line maybe isn't, the stop may not be chosen in the best spot, but it is what it is. So kind of this rail line will be here no matter what. And I guess, or that's the thoughts, but if this use is to stay industrial, you know, if that's an option, there's still going to be a new pedestrian connection, and there's still the path that comes through there is already there. And so I think there is, and we actually live at 14th and Dravis, so we're right kind of, and we're near the Red Mill Burgers, like right near all of it. And we walk through there, and, you know, the pedestrian kind of environment there is lacking. And regardless of what happens, regardless if more industrial use comes in, there is a big opportunity for more public kind of programming. And so I think looking at kind of what the case study that we talked about, what they did was they proposed kind of a series of small interventions to kind of test the area. So looking at it as almost installation based, but just little kind of small things to throw in, like, you know, they would put in what some examples of the tests that they would do.
I mean, the biggest intervention they did was using this crowdfunded bridge to literally reconnect the pedestrian experience of this neighborhood to the surrounding areas.
And touching down in places where there'll be like a beer hall. And there is some, you know, there's some breweries that are in that area already. So just kind of like peppering in these small uses to see how the area reacts. It seems like a really good first step is just to start testing and to see how the public reacts to it. Because I think you learn a lot from it. So rather than, I mean, we have 15 years until the rail station shows up. So rather than wait until then to have some grand master plan, it seems like something more adaptive and something that we're like seeing it as a laboratory, as they say, for experimentation, trying out things and seeing sort of what sticks and what works and what doesn't work.
The only problem is the state of Washington wants its money and they want their money now. So somebody's going to have to come up with $100 million to wait around to experiment in the marketplace. That is a big problem. If it were under other ownership, it might be a more gradual development, but nobody is going to pay them what they need. And they've been very clear about that in their disposition strategy, unless there is an actual plan that they can implement that makes money. That's the conundrum that we're in, which is why this project is so important from a student point of view, because the state may just offload this to the market without any plan. Well, that's not a great idea. And that's why this was so valuable to have the students create a vision for the state. Hopefully somebody in Olympia is listening.
And I think, I mean, public conversations this hasn't been a very public conversation in the city. Like, I know I've seen some articles because I've digged for them, and they're usually written by Rick. And like, this isn't a very public conversation. So it seems like it should be on everyone's radar that this is happening. And I think that's a big thing, that maybe the pressure, like one thing that the case study in Rotterdam does is they assembled the entire public of Rotterdam and kind of a crowdfunding campaign that was in a sense an act of resistance against the development. And it was a large amount of public pressure that made them change this whole area. So maybe that's what's missing is, you know, the public kind of standing up against it. And who knows if anyone would listen, but, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the state did do a fair amount of public engagement last summer. They had a number of open houses that were pretty well attended. And I do have to acknowledge the number of folks at The Urbanist who have been covering this pretty closely. Mike Eliason wrote some early articles related to this that in part inspired the studio, and Ray Dubicki has been pretty closely covering this. So it's not wide journalistic coverage, but The Urbanist at least has really been has been on top of this, conversation. And I just wanted to say I was testifying in Olympia regarding something unrelated to this. And Gail Tarleton presented the legislation for the Public Development Authority to her colleagues in the House of Representatives, and I listened to her presentation, and she specifically acknowledged the work of the students to her colleagues in the House of Representatives. So at least it's being talked about there. It hasn't been forgotten. So that was really good to see. Okay, we're running out of time, which is what I thought. And I don't know if I'm closing this out. I'm more than happy to close it out. Oh, here comes Kim. Hopefully to close it out.
Yes, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of our amazing innovators who joined us tonight. I know I've got a lot out of this conversation, and I'm not an architect, I'm not a planner. I'm just a citizen who is fascinated by the work that you do. So thank you, Jackie and Tristan, for your amazing original research in your exhibit. Thank you, Eddie, Mara, and Alicia, for your, your vision for a future of Seattle. And thank you, Grace and Rick and David, for your leadership in the field. This has been fantastic conversation, and I know that we could easily chat another hour, but I'm gonna have to say goodbye. Wish everyone a very good night. And once again, if you missed anything or want to rewatch this, we will get it up on our website in probably a week or two.
Well, thank you, Kim, and thanks to the Seattle Architecture Foundation for hosting this.